Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Mary, for inviting me to take part yesterday in this fantastic series of translation of poets accompanied by their translators. It's a brilliant series to be a part of. Everybody who's in it is going to feel good about it. And thank you very much as well to the English department for asking me to speak this evening. And I hope that you will. I'm not actually going to talk about. I'm sorry about this.
Okay.
I'm not going to talk about translating John Burnside into German.
No.
It's a much broader subject that I'm going to address. Although, of course, that could be dealt with in a broad way. But I think all of us probably have, as well as all of the research work and writing work that we do, articles and essays and whatever it is that you write, some pet subject, some pet ideas that continue beyond everyone, and they're still there after you've written about them. You're still not satisfied you've dealt with the issue in hand. And for me, over the years, the questions have been, what is translation? What is translation? And secondly, how does it feel? How does it actually feel to translate? What's going on there? In the sense of a kind of phenomenology of translation. The perceptions that you make, or the sense that you make of it as you're going along. And it's the second part of this. I've been dealing with these questions in a number of different ways. For instance, as far as the conclusion that I come to about what is translation, if I were just to put it in a very triangular and very simple form, if you think of etymology and cognates, and I feel that writing and translation are cognate, and that the kind of primal complex is reading. Reading is at the beginning. Reading of different kinds, and that if you have a kind of triangular relationship, that translation and writing both come from that. And I've been dealing with that I've been writing prose, sort of autobiographical prose, I suppose you could call it, or memoirs of childhood, in fact, in an attempt to get closer to what that's all about. And this is more perhaps the second part of those, or the second of those two questions. That question about what it feels like, what translation feels like, or its sensuality in a way. I'm going to, just to put you in the mood a little bit, I'm going to read a couple of passages from John Burnside's work, from his a long poem that I'm actually translating at the moment, the four quartets. Well, not the four quartets, just four quartets. We've got to make a distinction somewhere. And they're from the volume Gift Songs. And I'd just like to, I'm not really going to say much about what I'm going to read, except that you'll find probably in the course of my talk that what I read at the beginning finds a place. La Brière is one of the sections of the first of the quartets, called Saint-Nazaire. It turns out what we thought of as the soul is mostly sound. Not song, but like a memory of birds or running water, the churn of a paddle, the flicker and dip of an oar, narrow boats butting the land on their quiet tethers. So death will be a slower, surer fade than any we imagine. No mere extinction like the evening's hush before the ducks come, dipping to the marsh in threes and fours to find the darker ground. No moment's pause, but absolute decay, where absence is a form of generation. Out in the dark tonight, our voices drift and sway like hunting bees. Nothing to those who are going, but the place they started from, a given name, a word, a subtle variance from what endures, the bright unspeakable, not sky, not earth or flesh, but finer still, a call across the lake you half believe is nothing, though it happens all the time. End and beginning, footfall, leaffall, silence. Another section is called Yeard, which is a word that means earth, ground, earth. There was something I heard in the wind, geese, or the call of a vixen, or something else, beyond vocabulary. And sometimes at night, I feel myself alone in the dark and looking to see what there is between the near field and the kitchen door. The old familiar shifting in the grass beyond the garden, mute ghosts come from the sea. The gods that only stones and bulbs recall, rising like smoke and waiting to be found in the cry of a bird or the promise of midnight frost. Though nothing will come in a form I could recognize. No storybook figure, no cold face pressed to the glass, no girl in the attic weeping or clutching a doll, no eerie singing out along the hedge some August afternoon. Tonight, when I stop to imagine, nothing is there, or only a mist of rain on the leftover pea sticks, a glint of light, or something like a cry that might be nothing. Only the other world, unending, yet lost throughout time, in a circle of light, a murmur that comes through the wind, a hand's breadth, a wingspan, arriving from nowhere, or conjured up out of the dark, between the near field and the kitchen door, to sound me out, to comfort me with nothing. And finally, dirt road. Something that runs to copper or cornflower blue, a live creature bounding away from the glare of my headlamps, and, when the engine stops, a sudden quiet that waits to be filled by owls or cicadas. Though somebody else would say, it's only in the afterlife we get to talk about such things. The scent of diesel misting on our fingers, a motion in the sky that never stops, and how the brimming undergrowth is laced with boundaries, the softness underfoot, a terminus that shifts and wanders, though the end is all, it seems, another colour, not quite red or mauve, a trace of cold, more urgent than a kiss, arriving like some homespun messenger to isolate this waking from the dark. When we learn to speak, we are learning to translate, said Octavio Paz, who is somebody who had a great influence on John Burnside's poetry at the very beginning, when he was starting out. He's written about how Spanish poetry was actually the cradle out of which much of his early work emerged. Recognised as one of the finest poets writing in the English language today, John Burnside is also one of Britain's most ambitious novelists and short story writers. He has gained a reputation too as a memoirist of unsparing honesty, while his talents as a reviewer and essayist will be evident to anybody who has followed his contributions to newspapers and literary journals. However, John Burnside is not, at least not in the conventional interlingual sense, renowned as a translator. My choice of subject for this evening's talk, then, figures of translation in the poetry of John Burnside, owes less to the conventional notion of translation as a form of rewriting or composition that is situated between, across, or at a meeting point of languages and cultures, than to a generous understanding of the rhetorical trope of metaphora, or, in Quintilian's terminology, translatio, which, in the words of Shakespeare scholar Michael Neal, is the figure by means of which language sought to cope with the experience of the new, the unfamiliar, the other. Moreover, as John Burnside's German translator, I have been aware of at least two senses in which his poetry in a manner that may be exemplary for poetry or even writing in general, can be thought of as exhibiting what we might call a metaphoricity of translation. That is to say that in reading and talking about Burnside's poems, we may be inclined to use terms such as transformation, otherness, encounter, migration, displacement, doubleness, resistance, risk, loss, impossibility, or hiatus. In other words, we are likely to find ourselves referring to those very tropes and concepts whose elucidation pegs out the paradigmatic territory of contemporary translation theory. In the first of these senses, then, John Burnside's poetry, with its openness to European and Eastern, for example, Taoist thought and writing, and its ear for American, including Middle and Latin American sensibilities, subjects, landscapes, and rhythms, exhibits characteristics which incorporate the broader conception of translation as a function of exchange or transfer between cultures, languages, media, disciplines, and periods. Many of Burnside's poems, for example, and each in its different way, address the distribution and negotiation of borders, habitats, and spaces, the conditions of transference, mutation, and transmigration, as well as questions of endings, continuity, and new beginnings. While in one sense such truths are always local, as he writes in the poem After Lucretius, his is nevertheless a poetry that seeks to bring the interrogation of even the tiniest parishes of mutability and transformation into relation with all knowledge and experience, and who, to this end, is continually engaged in a kind of translatio studii, a cross-cultural transfer of ideas and images, referencing and importing the science of other times, cultures, and places. A brief look in his poetry collections at his use of epigraphs, the majority of which are drawn from out with English language writing, may illustrate not only the way John Burnside attempts to decenter his thought and poetry culturally, placing it instead in a semiotic continuum, in Yuri Lotman's phrase, but also his tendency to choose epigraphs which are themselves suggestive, again in Lotman's terminology, of polyglottism and universal translatability. The first poem of his volume, The Asylum Dance, the sequence Ports, for example, begins with an epigraph taken from Henri Michaud's poem, Sur Étrave, on the bow. Pas de port, port inconnu. No port, unknown ports. An almost slogan-like gesture that immediately throws the reader into a quandary of unknowing, or of acknowledging that the outcome or destination of our crossing or bearing across may be, or rather must be, uncertain. Although the same volume ends with another sequence entitled Roads, Burnside does not choose as an epigraph for that poem the strikingly similar, but possibly too obvious, aphorism that has inspired other writers, composers, and film directors, including Luigi Nono and Andrei Tarkovsky, namely a medieval inscription on a monastery wall near Toledo. No hay caminos, hay que caminar. There are no roads, there is only walking. A legend that also influenced Antonio Machado. Caminante, son tus huellas el camino, y nada más. Caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar. Wanderer, or maybe pilgrim, seeing as on a monastery wall. Your footsteps are the path and nothing else. Sorry, your footsteps are the path and nothing else. Wanderer, there is no path. The path is made by walking. The inscription would have been entirely germane to Burnside's work, but instead, for the road sequence, he chooses lines by Octavio Paz. Transcurrir es suficiente. Transcurrir es quedarse. To pass is enough. To pass is to stay. And indeed, the poem contains several other references to Paz's poetry, an early influence on Burnside's work. The topology of roads, paths, and the way has enjoyed universal appeal in ancient and modern cultures, particularly as in the case of a passing that is simultaneously dying and survival, in its metaphorical relations to and conceptual patterning of the journey of life. Several of Burnside's epigraphs, and indeed many of his poems, are concerned in a similar way with a post-Babylonian translational paradox. Survival that is simultaneously erasure, or transformation, or displacement, or loss of identity. A phenomenon which Walter Benjamin links to the Nachleben of the text, its translatability and afterlife. This is the carrying across, or issuing of utterance into language or translation, which Jacques Derrida, in his essay on what he calls the poematic, refers to as a traversal outside yourself, away from home, venturing towards the language of the other in view of an impossible or denied translation, necessary but desired like a death. Thus, another sequence from the same volume, Fields, is introduced by a sentence from Edvard Munch: "From my rotting body flowers shall grow, and I am in them, and that is eternity." Or a poem called Birth Songs in The Light Trap carries an epigraph from Lucretius: "Mutat enim mundi naturam totius aetas, ex alioque alios status excipere omnia debet, nec manet ulla sui similis res, omnia migrant." For age changes the nature of the whole world. Another state must receive everything from yet another, and nothing remains similar to itself. Everything changes. Or above, after Lucretius, also from The Light Trap, his poem title itself echoing the idea of the adaptation, or Nachdichtung, he places the following quotation from the Latin poets De Rerum Natura: "Nam quodcumque suis mutatum finibus exit, continuo hoc mors est, ilius quod fuit ante." Whatever from its own confines passes changed, this is at once the death of what went before. Or again, preceding Saint-Nazaire, the first of the 4 quartets in the volume Gift Songs, there is Karl Marx: "In history, as in nature, decay is the laboratory of life." Elsewhere in his 12 volumes of poetry to date, and variously echoing translation tropes of erasure, displacement, and absence, we find a Chinese saying which states, "He who remembers forgets." Or John Keats's, "Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter." Or this, from Jean Baudrillard's work, Impossible Exchange: "Chaque existence est ainsi le fruit d'une double déclinaison. C'est en ce sens qu'elle est une forme duelle et non individuelle. Nous ne sommes pas libres d'exister sur le seul versant de notre moi, de notre identité, ni sur le seul versant du monde dit réel. Tout nous vient de cette adversité, de cette complicité jumelle. Le destin se partage comme la pensée qui nous vient de l'autre. Chacun est le destin de l'autre. Il n'y a pas de destin individuel." Thus, each existence is the product of a double declension. It is in this sense that it is a dual, not an individual form. We are not free to exist just on the side of our ego, our identity, or just on that of the so-called real world. We are wholly the products of this adversity, this twin complicity. Destiny is divided like thought, which comes to us from the other. Each is the destiny of the other. There is no individual destiny. But if in some of these quotations a vestige of anxiety remains over the radical interrogation of identity and loss of self, In the poems themselves, such transformations, for all their dangers and risks and estrangement, are more likely to be embraced as a conduit to survival, an opening to homecoming and rebirth. I spoke earlier of at least two ways in which many of John Burnside's poems could be described as exhibiting the metaphoricity of translation, and I shall begin my discussion of the second of these categories by reading part of a poem from his most recent volume, All One Breath. Instructions for a Sky Burial ends with a passage, by the way, Instructions for a Sky Burial, in translation, will probably be the title of the next book of John Burnside's poems in German. Ends with a passage which, echoing the tenor of some of the epigraphs cited, their awareness of passing, can be seen as a celebration of the possibilities of transmutation and of what Walter Benjamin, in The Task of the Translator, calls the vital connection between the text and its afterlife. It's quite a long poem, and this is the ending of it. So when that day arrives, when I shall die, carry me out of the house, unwashed and naked, and leave me in the open, where the crows can find me. Dogs, if there are dogs. There will be rats, but let them eat their fill, so what they leave can blend into the soil more easily. Some moisture will be lost to heat and wind, but something more will live again as fodder. Meadowgrass and daisies, rue and hawthorn, all the living knots of larvae in the scattering of flesh and bone, birds gathering the hair to line their nests, the last ants busy about the mouth, while something inexact and perfect forms itself around the last faint wisp of vein or tendon. Something like a song, but taking shape implacably itself, new breath and vision gathered from the quiet. Beyond his attention to the migration and translation of ideas, then, many of Burnside's poems can be read as detailed enactments of translation processes in intimate or local contexts. Such poems bear witness to encounters in which an afterlife or passage to survival by way of mutation or exchange, whether of beings living or dead, perceptions, dreams, moods, or concepts, becomes the focus of emerging consciousness, language, and meaning. It is my assessment that not only do such encounters lead us to the dialogical heartland of John Burnside's poetry, but that many of Burnside's poems, in the course of their exposition to such meetings and findings, in the course of their exposition of such meetings and findings, provide a viable map of both poetry's and translation's debatable territories. In their searching and reticulating reconstructions of the volatile scenes and landscapes of emergent language, or langage à l'état naissant, as Paul Valéry called it, or again in Paul Celan's words, Sprache in statu nascendi, or frei werdende Sprache. Burnside's poems invite readerly participation in the matter and materials of translation as a sensual and existential process. Translation in this context, not defined to its meaning as a literary, linguistic, or rhetorical activity, is essential to lived human experience, a primordial cultural skill, even, as we have seen in the poem I have just cited, a matter of life and death. Burnside's poetic, not unlike a translator's, researches a glimpsed other life of things that are gifted with absence, speaking a different tongue. That's a quotation from the poem Fields. The focus of this writing is not, however, a world different from our own. Instead, it attempts to reveal the lost or submerged, but nonetheless essential domains of the here and now. Indeed, Burnside has described his poetic discipline in epistemological terms as a form of scientia, a technique for reclaiming the authentic, a method for reinstating the real, and as a slow, lyrical, and fairly tentative attempt to understand and describe a meaningful way of dwelling in this extraordinary world. Those quotations, little quotations, were from an essay called Poetry as Ecology. Dwelling being another of his big subjects. One formal resolution peculiar to many of Burnside's poems, their use of line gaps and breaks and caesuras, breathing pauses, stops and starts, which are also thinking pauses or stepping stones. If you look at I'm not quite sure actually if I can just find one quickly, but if you're acquainted with his work, you'll know what I mean by these by the stepping arrangement of his poems. But as he's gone on, as his work has developed, he seems to have left that behind rather, and most of the lines are conventional lines now. But if you go to a volume like The Light Trap, then the poems are more or less arranged in little sort of hemistichs across the page. They are like, when you're reading them aloud or whatever, they are like thoughts coming after each other. I'm saying that these stepping stones, this arrangement, is fully conducive to poetry conceived as research, or as an expedition, or as a kind of laboratory for the thought experiment, or the search for a word, a tone, a translation. You often find him, it isn't a sort of, in a way it's a confession that there is no mot juste. He doesn't sort of say, right, this is what it is, I've got the exact metaphor. He just goes on and on, trying to, varying the concepts, varying the metaphors, to try and get close to what he's talking about. Research is the dedicated activity of homo quaerens, a prolonged tentative quest for and provisional disclosure of the hidden dimensions of the real. Questing and describing in the uncharted interstices of the world can be described as a kind of divine wandering, as Socrates playfully defines eletheia, or truth in Plato's Cratylus dialogue. The movement of speech in pursuit of illumination, when the thought which promised that enlightenment, as Augustine of Hippo tells us, has hidden in its secret place. The wandering, shifting shape of Burnside's passing text bodies form the provisional and hazardous quality. Wait a minute, I think I've got something wrong in my text here. Basically what I'm saying is that these shifting shapes, the passing text bodies, as I say, denote or grasp at the process of thinking and vocalizing the poet's and reader's participation in all the stages and detours of the poem, mapping a translation journey to utterance, a looking always worked towards a word, trading the limits of speech for the unsaid presence, as Burnside writes in the poem Taxonomy, which is in The Light Trap. The Asylum Dance. However unique to Burnside, however sui generis, this poetic transcript, often eschewing stanzas, caesuras dividing line after line into a kind of cascade of hemistichs, or perhaps, more accurately, an isometric thought moments. The format is also reminiscent of the oldest English poetry, resembling the vernacular West Saxon verse structures wrought by the Beowulf poet, whose line gaps, repudiating the elegance of the Latin line, reflected the pauses and progression of common speech. As well as reinventing traditional forms, John Burnside's restless, frontier-testing poemscapes have counterparts and find inspiration in work that has been written in our own time, although its provenance is arguably as distant from contemporary British poetry as Beowulf, arguably. Engaging with one important source of his reading in a study of work by Robert Wrigley, Bridget Pegeen Kelly and Jory Graham, Burnside has written, "What contemporary US poetry has, it seems to me, is a method, a showing forth of the process of reflection, a revelation of a provisional and ever-shifting internal dialectic that much British poetry refuses to pursue, informed by a bad faith that says it is better to avoid such matters altogether in order to avoid any risk of sentimentality or pretension." It's from an essay called Mind the Gap on reading American poetry. Those of you who are acquainted with his poetry will deduce, on the basis of even the short passage cited, that Burnside's reading of US poetry must have gone hand in glove with a meditation on the process of research and the continuous interrogation of reality in his own poems, a showing forth of the process of reflection, a revelation of a provisional and ever-shifting internal dialectic. There could hardly be a more pertinent description of John Burnside's own unremitting exploration between early volumes such as Feast Days and his most recent collection, All One Breath, in 2014, into the generation and representation of emergent meaning, and what is more, into the continuous emergence of the world itself. Vis-à-vis the term emergent meaning, consciousness or language, I've already cited expressions used by the poets Paul Valéry and Paul Celan. When we speak of the emergent language of the poem, Valéry's langage à l'état naissant, we are referring to that birth moment or crisis when the poem or image or thought or impression finds a home in language, but at the same time invites its own destruction by dissemination or assimilation to the conventions of language. A catastrophe, Derrida's word, that is at once a survival, a disfigurement that is at once the passage to an afterlife. En route, perhaps, to a shoreline of the heart, as Paul Celan wrote. In the context of Burnside's championing of US poetry, I might add to Valéry and Celan the mysterious, even mystical closing sentences of a short essay published in 1983 by another American poet. The translator, Charles Simic, writes in a short essay entitled The Infinitely Forked Mother Tongue. The translator is a close reader, perhaps an ideal reader. He reads in a way that will make him come close and finally inhabit the self that is composing the original. He is like a shaman, the enemy of boundaries. The aim of that discipline and technique is to become an other, to speak in tongues. The dream of the translator is to experience a self that is on the verge of utterance, to catch it in the very instant before it has divided itself into logos and melos. I am thinking of that mouth where the great mother tongue is beginning to fork infinitely. In Simic's view of the critical moment before the poem's entry into and contamination by language, a moment before the mystery of encounter, as Paul Celan put it, when the poem holds its, this is Celan again, holds its ground on its own margin, constantly withdrawing from an already no more into a still here. The shamanic self of the translator, its ego dissolved, inhabiting the self that is composing the original, and now on the verge of utterance, is simultaneously the mouth that predates Babel, or rather, it constitutes utterance on the utopian threshold of the confusion of tongues. From the passing of that moment, the nunc stans of what Simic calls the dream of the translator. Translation will retain the aporetic mark of its forkedness, of its necessity as impossibility, as Derrida put it. And the poem correspondingly will come to know its lack, pleading for translation, as Benjamin writes. Roland Barthes has reassured us, however, that the compensation for this state of affairs is the pleasure we as readers take in the translated text. Thus, the biblical myth is reversed. The confusion of tongues is no longer a punishment. The subject gains access to bliss by the cohabitation of languages working side by side. The text of pleasure is a sanctioned Babel. The pleasure of the text. Having barely begun to say something about the metaphoricity of translation in John Burnside's poetry, his intralingual work of translation, so to speak, I would like to turn now to one of his rare interlingual translations. In other words, to a translation in the conventional sense, which Burnside published in the study of US poetry I've already cited, but which also appears in Gift Songs as part of the final section of his long sequence 4 quartets. The essay, concerned as it is, in the main, with reading American poetry, carries the title Mind the Gap, an injunction, albeit pointing in this context to the gap between British and American sensibilities, that is likely to remind the reader of one of Burnside's central motifs, the gap, or hiatus, the in-between. For his novels, stories, poems, and essays contain frequent reference to events and things that occur in gaps between the hidden and the revealed. Presences intuited during encounters with twilight creatures, shadows suddenly flitting across the headlamps on a homeward drive, haunting shapes at the edge of our vision. In a different essay entitled Poetry and a Sense of Place, he relates this gap or space between the self and the other to a precedent in Celtic mythology, which he calls the Ider Éire, a concept which resurfaces as a section title in the 4 quartets in his 2007 collection, Gift Songs. Burnside describes this interstices as neither one place nor another, but the space between the two, the locus of transformations. Humans become birds or animals, the old are rejuvenated, the human and the fairy are indistinguishable. This gap is also the space in which several versions of a place or a person can exist simultaneously, depending on the choices made by the protagonist. One or other of these possibilities emerges into the temporal world. In other words, this magical space is where identity unfolds and is capable of transformation. It is the boundary between one state and another where magic is possible. The gap in which several versions of the same thing can exist simultaneously, the toi in yin, as Don Patterson put it, world of Schrödinger's cat and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, is a terrain much inhabited by translators too, a place where the contracts between the object world and language are experienced as provisional and are constantly rewritten. The bilingual poet and translator Peter Waterhouse has described this threshold as an in-between zone that is wordless and at the same time intensely worldly, blank, while at the same time at the center of something, a crisis, a critical silence, a space for instability, a place for change, charged with namelessness, full of the intensity of not knowing. In that silent center, a tree is very different from what we call a tree, a river from what we call a river. The wider this non-identical, unattainable, unestablishable body opens, the greater is the ability to link up with and encompass what is other, diverse, rich. Losing and finding turn out to be involved in the same movement. They are opposites because they are identical. Waterhouse's thoughts on the limen that gapes in the presence of different languages invite us to ponder the indeterminacy and instability of the relations between words and things, whether we see that relationship as intimate and material or provisional and arbitrary, whether we think that we determine what we speak ourselves, or whether, as Heidegger proposed, the language speaks us. There is likely to be some consensus that our languages and lexica develop and are passed down as the legacy of previous generations, and that the drama of early language acquisition, played out in dialogue between the generations, is constitutive in cultural memory in the set of dialogical relations that inform our sense of place and belonging, and, no less importantly, in transactions between ourselves and a living, changing environment. John Burnside's translation is one of the Ligurian poet Eugenio Montale's Ossi di Seppia, the cuttlefish bones, probably written between 1921 and 1925, and usually known after its first line as Forse un mattino andando in un'aria di vetro, perhaps one morning walking in an air of glass. It is a poem Burnside has written about in another essay too, called The Wonder of Daylight, in search of a delicate balance, although without, in that piece, including his own translation, which runs as follows. Perhaps on a day like this, the morning air like cut glass, I will turn around to see the miracle, the nothing at my shoulder, utter void caught in the sudden twist of a drunkard's terror. Perhaps, like the beginning of a film, the world will come again. Houses and trees and nuzzling hills return one by one for the grand illusion, though by then it will be too late, as I hurry on, among those who have never looked back, with my given secret. The first word of the poem, perhaps, repeated as the first word of the third stanza, as well as the sense of conditionality that pervades the poem, suggests that the miracle, this opening to the secret that lies behind us, always out of sight, in the gap, so to speak, but in fact pervading the world of the grand illusion, can only take place in an imagined future, in Ernst Bloch's not yet, so to speak, while words like terror and void in the translation imply that the initiation may not be an entirely pleasant experience. The poem, as Burnside suggests in the essay A Delicate Balance, is about catching a glimpse of a new model of reality. The miracle that those who have never looked back may never perceive, the utter void behind us that gives the lie to the grand illusion of our frontal vision, has changed the subject beyond recall. In an essay on this poem, the Italian writer Italo Calvino refers us to a legend of the Wisconsin and Minnesota wood dwellers, cited by Jorge Luis Borges in his fantastic Zoology. There is, Calvino writes, an animal called the hide-behind, which, when you go for wood in the forest, is always behind you, following you everywhere. You turn around, but however quick you are, the hide-behind is quicker still, and has moved behind you already. You will never find out what it looks like, but it is always there. We could say that Montale's man is the one that has managed to turn around and see what the hide-behind looks like, and it is more frightening than any other animal. It is the void. According to Burnside, however, the transformation implied need not be viewed as a negative experience, even if the reaction to it in the first instance is fear. Indeed, the implied initiation is a threshold to a more holistic vision of human potential, a dialectic that, informed by the nothingness by which it is haunted, is played out, thesis by thesis, in the miraculous, yet entirely provisional wonder of daylight. End of quote. The losing is no less a finding, to paraphrase Peter Waterhouse. The retrospective account of this change, beyond the panic it induces, is not very different from Burnside's description of a discovery he finds at the heart of the most interesting American poetry. Quote, as human creatures unable to bear very much reality, we feel wonder, awe, and panic when space opens for a moment, and in a meeting with an animal, or a glimpse of the force that through the green fuse drives the flower, we see into the fabric of the world itself, a vision that both reaffirms the continuity of that world and leaves us doubtful of our own place in it, other than as creatures to be transformed into new lives, new forms, in which nothing of the flesh and the dreams that are so tender to us can survive. The sense of reaffirmation of the continuity of things that is at the same time inextricably linked to our own ultimate transformation is, at one level, no more than our acquiescence to the inevitable life cycle of our species. But at a more personal level, it suggests the possibility of recognition and return to something primal that is laid down in each of us, a heterocentric form of individuality that emerged in childhood through a formative dialogue between self and other. Can I just ask what the time is?
It's just going up to 7.
Oh, right. I just think that I might jump a bit. Leave out a page or two. I want to end with a poem called De Anima. And what I'm working towards up until now is the idea of the dialogue between self and other constituting a heterocentric self. And I'm using this poem, De Anima, by John Burnside, to illustrate the way that children, when they are confronting animals for the first time, start up that dialogue. It looks like naming, but it is actually the constitution of the self that's happening. Here's a quotation from James McMurray. It goes in here somewhere. A Scottish philosopher. Human experience is, in principle, shared experience. If you remember the Baudrillard quotation as well. Human experience is, in principle, shared experience. Human life, even in its most individual elements, is a common life. And human behavior carries always, in its inherent structure, a reference to the personal other. All this may be summed up by saying that the unit of personal existence is not the individual, but two persons in personal relation, and that we are persons not by individual right, but in virtue of our relation to one another. The personal is constituted by personal relatedness. The unit of the personal is not the I, but the you and I. And in the paper, as it goes on, I relate this to the dialogue between child and animal, this you and I. And in it, I cite Paul Shepherd, a naturalist, who, again, John has been very influential on John Burnside's work. And in his early works, in his essays, he was always quoting Paul Shepherd. He doesn't anymore. Human intelligence, says Paul Shepherd, is bound to the presence of animals. They are the means by which cognition takes its first shape, and they are the instruments for imagining abstract ideas and qualities, therefore giving us consciousness. They are the code images by which language retrieves ideas from memory at will. They are a means to self-identity and self-consciousness as our most human possession, for they enable us to objectify qualities and traits. By presenting us with related otherness, that diversity of non-self with which we have various things in common, they further, throughout our lives, a refining and maturing knowledge of personal and human being. Burnside's poem, whose length forbids me to read all of it on this occasion, instead I shall read the beginning and the end, begins with the speaker's son learning insects, but soon introduces a related theme, the question of what we mean when we speak of the soul, related perhaps via Aristotle's sophisticated theory of the soul. The poem is subtitled after Aristotle, which is grounded on qualities of learning, attending, knowledge, and immaterial actuality. So this is the beginning of De Anima. My son is learning insects, woodlouse, bee, a line of ants, a lone fritillary. He finds them on a flagstone or a leaf and quizzes them, the start of dialogue and so commencement of the soul's unfolding. self-invention in a world that shifts and turns but really has no end. And surely what we mean by soul is something no anatomist could find, a total sum of movement and exchange. In fact, the second theme opened in the poem is not so much the definition of the soul, but the salient concept of dialogue. The commencement of the soul's unfolding is dependent on, and its progression is shaped in, exchange. The soul is a life spirit formed through the individual's transactions with a living planet, non-anatomical, immaterial, yet intensely personal, quote, more dialogue than gland, something that grows by being in the world. As learning moves from the stage of infantile translation, where an outside indistinguishable from an inside constitutes an inside, the individual learns to negotiate by differentiation of the inside what John McMurray called the heterocentricity of the self, its partial extraterritoriality. Burnside's poem ends with a beautiful poignancy and wildness that is simultaneously intensely personal, with a reflection on the drama of differentiation, of return and withdrawal. It is an experience of loss and estrangement that is at the same time a finding and memory of displacement, a return to the home place that is at the same time an assertion of unbelonging, a fear of the division, which is at the same time an affirmation of heterocentricity, a questioning of self that is equally an empathic exchange with the other or non-human, a vision of the miracle in Montali's terms that has given the subject his secret. I shall close my talk by reading the final sentence of the poem. My son is learning insects, millipede and beetle, painted lady, may or dragonfly, and watching, I perceive how mind evolves, one meeting at a time, spider and fly, lizard and drowsing cattle, dolphin, skewer, shapes in the tide or months of songbirds, in this house, amid the fields we've rented for the summer, how the sounds and tastes go down like script, unmemorized and not to be forgotten. Like the bird I saw one evening on my journey home, a migrant foreigner that must have strayed to what I knew of sky and open fields. Some northern bird, perhaps, its feathers red around the throat and chest, its hollow song, so much a question to the self I was. I came through on the far side of the day, uncertain, plundered, given up for lost.
Thank you.